Meanwhile, South Africa's agricultural sector faced significant challenges in 2024, including the devastating weather conditions that weighed on summer crops as well as disease outbreaks affecting livestock. And joining me with greater insight on the ins and outs of the industry is Chief Economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa, Wandile Sihlobo. Wandile, thanks so much for your time today. As mentioned, a downbeat showing from the sector last year. I mean, even when looking at that third quarter GDP print, we saw the sector down almost 29%. Just as we get started, walk us through the dynamics that were at play last year.
I think when we finally receive the 2024 full year data on GDP, the South African agricultural sector will show contraction. And part of the reason is, as you explained, but I think it helps to look into this sector with its three important subsectors, which is the field crops. That's mainly grains and sugar cane production. And then you have the half of it, which is livestock and poultry. And the other important subsector, of course, is horticulture, fruits and vegetables. If you take a closer look at what was happening, you will see that there's a mixed performance, although the overall headline figure will be negative for the year. The difficulties were mainly on the field crops because of the midsummer drought that led to a 23% decline in our 2024 summer grains and the oilseeds harvest. The other challenge we face were animal diseases, particularly foot and mouth disease in the cattle industry. But if you look at the fruits and wine and even vegetable production, we did quite very well there. But I think the overall production of it, because of these two subsectors, will come up being negative for 2024.
Let's talk about the bright spots there. You did mention the fruit and veg industry doing quite well. What boosted that performance in particular?
If you think about our sector, I mean, I've made the point that the field crop were mainly underpinned that contraction because of the midsummer drought.
Yes.
But the reality is that all of our fruit and vegetables are under irrigation. In the grains and oilseeds, only about 20% of that is under irrigation. And in 2024, we were also lucky because we had a stable power supply. So folks can irrigate their crops and we were able to do it, which is why the output on the fruit was so good. It's actually so good to an extent that although the overall agricultural performance will be negative, if you think about our exports, you will realize that just in the first 3 quarters of last year, South Africa's agricultural exports were actually up by 4% at about $10.6 billion US. And I think when we get the Q4 figures, we'll actually hit a record export for 2024 in the midst of all of that downbeat performance for the sector. And I think the big part of it is that excellent harvest in the food production side, as well as to a certain extent the recovery in the livestock industry, which we only started to see around the end of Q3 and Q4.
Now, Wandile, now that 2024 is behind us, it seems 2025 is starting on a positive note. The shift from, El Nino to La Nina has brought much needed rain to the country. Will this change in weather patterns be the catalyst the sector needs to drive growth, further growth in 2025?
I mean, absolutely. I think 2025 will be a recovery period for South Africa. Thinking about what dragged us last year being the animal diseases and the midsummer drought, this year we are starting with excellent rains. And yes, indeed, not all regions of South Africa have received optimal rains. In parts of Mpumalanga, rains were late. Parts of Limpopo, rains were late, even in certain regions of the Free State. But I think when you consider the last week of December into January this year, much of those regions managed to get their rains, and we will have planting that is delayed in other regions. But I think overall, it will be a recovery. And the second part, which was a drag for us, were animal diseases. But as we entered the fourth quarter of 2024, we were already managing to control the animal diseases. Only 2 provinces still had challenges. It was parts of the Eastern Cape and parts of KZN. But all of the other provinces were cleared and we were back into the export markets. So I think this year we will build on that. And if the electricity supply remains stable, as Eskom promises us, and I think then we'll be able to irrigate fairly particularly well in our fruit and also get the excellent wine harvest. So on the basis of those, I'm optimistic. The only worry which we always look at is the logistics, of course,
Yes.
because ultimately farmers can farm, but the logistics remains a key issue to consider.
A turnaround plan is in progress there, so hopefully we'll start, seeing things taking place and things getting into motion. I just want to go back to the fruits and vegetables. Yes, we are seeing, a cessation of load shedding and that helping on that front, but we can't ignore some of the bans that we've seen come through over the past few years. We know that Botswana has started phasing out those bans, but Namibia still has the bans in place. How much of an impact has that had, considering that they aren't necessarily like really big markets that we export to?
Challenge with vegetables is the fact that you can't really export them to far away markets like we do with fruits and the other commodities because of their perishability. And I mean, you are right. Namibia, our desire in South Africa is that they will lift that ban that is there, because so far it does present a lot of pressure, because these markets used to be part and parcel of what we produce for as South Africa. But with Botswana having lifted the ban gradually, and will phase out further bans somewhere in May so that that market is fully open, that's the optimistic note that we are looking at. Thinking about last year, of course, that did lead to a decline in our exports for vegetables, but we were compensated by the fact that we saw the fruits exports increasing. But the other aspect we can't ignore here is that the bans do put inflationary pressures on these countries. In South Africa in November, vegetable prices were in deflation, negative 2.8%. If you look at in food inflation in Botswana, vegetable price inflation was at over 13%. And in Namibia, it's the same thing. I do think that the local authorities in these countries will have to also consider the inflationary pressures of their domestic policies.
Wandile, what have you made of what some would call a wave of protectionism that we've seen playing out? I mean, we just touched on the bans that are at play in the SADC region, but this is also playing out globally. We know what's taking place in the EU. We also have Trump coming in as the president of the US come the 20th of January. And, he has that Trump first approach that could also be seen as protectionism.
President Trump comes at a time where the world is just looking inward. I think ever since the COVID period, most of the countries began thinking about how they boost their domestic production. And the consequence of that then is them closing up. In Europe, we see that as we speak today in January 2025, the farmers out there in countries like France, they are on the streets protesting, saying that they don't want imports of various agricultural products in their countries. So in South Africa, we look at these things and we worry, because we export about half of what we produce, over $13 billion a year. And countries like the regions like the EU are some of the important ones for us. But we think that we have to continuously talk to them so that we retain that market access. And that's the conversation that must be led by Minister Steenhuisen, Minister Parks, and Minister Ronald Lamola. At the same time, though, we do have to think about the diversification of our markets, work relentlessly to open up the BRICS markets and further additional markets within the Middle East and Asia, while at the same time retaining the access that we have in the continent, Europe, and the Americas.
Wandile, thanks so much for your time and just sharing your insights. That was Chief Economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa, Wandile Sihlobo.